He wasn't supposed to want her this much, but the fire in his chest and the heat in her eyes made restraint impossible. Desert was not a place for the weak. It was a place of dust and fire, where the sun hung like a merciless god in the sky and the earth cracked open from thirst. It was here that he lived, and it was here that men learned his name only in whispers. They called him the rough Apache, though he had been born with another name long ago. That name was buried, like so many things in his past, beneath blood, sand, and silence. He rode alone most days, his Mustang carrying him across dry plains and jagged hills, the wind blowing grit against his face like tiny blades. His body bore scars, some old, some fresh, each one a story that no man dared to ask about. His eyes were darker than the desert nights, and when they fixed on someone, they carried the weight of storms. The rough Apache was not a man who sought company. Settlements feared him, soldiers hunted him, and yet he survived, always one step ahead, always untouchable. There was a roughness about him that was not only in his weathered skin or the unshaven line of his jaw. It lived in the way he carried himself, in the way his hand hovered near his weapon, and in the way his silence pressed heavier than words. But survival came at a price. A man who lives with no one but the wind begins to feel the emptiness press in. He was not soft, not sentimental, yet he could not deny that hunger existed in him, the hunger not just for food or drink, but for something beyond war and wandering. He would never speak it aloud, but he knew it well, the hunger for touch, for closeness, for the kind of warmth that no fire could give. One evening, as the sun bled itself out across the horizon, he came upon a small settlement tucked between red cliffs. It was nothing more than a scatter of wooden shacks, a saloon leaning crooked against the wind, and a few stubborn souls who had chosen to wrestle life from the desert's grip. His arrival was not unnoticed. Children stopped their play, women pulled laundry from lines, and men paused with tools in their hands. All eyes turned toward him, some wide with fear, others sharp with suspicion. He dismounted slowly, the leather creaking under his weight. Dust swirled around his boots as he tied the reins of his horse to the rail outside the saloon. No words were spoken, but the silence was louder than any shout. They had heard stories of raids, of blood, of the rough Apache who rode like a shadow and struck like a storm. He pushed through the swinging doors of the saloon. The air inside was cooler but heavy with smoke and the sour scent of whiskey. A piano sat silent in the corner, its keys gathering dust. The barkeep, a broad man with lines carved deep into his face, stiffened at the sight of him. "What'll it be?" the barkeep asked, his voice steady though his hands betrayed a slight tremor. The Apache's gaze swept the room, noting every face, every movement. He was used to this reception, the way men tightened their grip on cards or glasses, the way women slipped quietly out of sight. He ordered whiskey with a low word, his voice rough as gravel. The barkeep poured quickly, sliding the glass across the counter with practiced caution. The Apache lifted the glass but did not drink. Instead, he stared into the amber liquid as if it held some memory, some ghost. His thoughts were his own, locked behind the hard set of his jaw to those who watched him. He was a figure of danger, a man who carried both mystery and menace in equal measure. To himself, he was simply a survivor, a man forged by fire, betrayal, and endless miles of barren land. Yet beneath the hardened shell, beneath the scars and the silence, there was a man who still burned with something deeper, desire, longing, the need to feel alive, beyond the fight for survival. And it was here, in this settlement, that the course of his life would begin to change. He did not know it yet, but fate had a way of leading even the roughest men into moments that stripped them bare. For all his strength, for all his shadows, the rough Apache was still a man. And soon, he would meet the one who would remind him just how human he truly was. Saloon settled into a nervous quiet after his arrival. A few men coughed into their sleeves. Others kept their eyes fixed on their cards, pretending to be absorbed in the game. But everyone in that room felt his presence like a storm cloud pressing down. The rough Apache had a way of shifting the air, making it heavier, more dangerous, even when he said nothing at all. He sat at the far end of the counter, drinking his whiskey in measured sips. He wasn't here for trouble, though trouble had a way of finding him wherever he rode. He told himself he would drink, rest his horse, and leave before the sun rose again. That had been his rhythm for years. Keep moving, never settle, never linger. Lingering was how men got trapped, and then she appeared at first. It was only the sound that drew his attention, the soft swish of skirts against worn wood, the faint clink of a tray carrying glasses. She moved from table to table with a grace that seemed out of place in this rough corner of the desert. Her presence was like water in the dry air, something clean and quiet that made the whole room tilt toward her without realizing it. The rough Apache's eyes followed her without meaning to. She was young, perhaps too young to be working in a saloon filled with bitter men and restless cowhands. Her face carried a softness, untouched by the hardness of the desert, though there was a strength in her eyes that belied her gentle movements. She smiled politely at the men, but it was a smile of duty, not desire. When her gaze lifted and met his, the world shifted. It was only for a breath, a heartbeat, but it was enough. The rest of the saloon faded, the shuffling of cards, the scrape of boots, even the music of laughter that came too loud and too forced. In that instant, it was only the two of them, the rough Apache, with his scars and silence, and the young woman with her quiet fire. She quickly looked away, her cheeks tinged with color, and moved to another table. But he had already seen what she tried to hide: curiosity, fear, and something else, that mirrored the hunger inside him. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly on the counter. He had known many women before, in fleeting nights and passing towns. But this was different. Something about her presence unsettled him, as though she carried a secret that called to him louder than the whiskey in his glass. Barkeep noticed his gaze and cleared his throat. "That's Anna," he muttered, low enough for only him to hear. "She don't belong in this place, but life don't always care where it throws you. Don't bring her trouble." The Apache didn't respond. He didn't need to. Trouble was stitched into the fabric of his being, and though he hadn't asked for it, it followed him like a shadow. Still, he knew better than to let himself get pulled in by something he couldn't have, and yet he couldn't stop watching her. Later, when the crowd thinned and the night outside grew heavy with stars, she passed near his table again. This time, their eyes met longer. She hesitated, as though deciding whether to speak, and in that hesitation he saw her soul. There was a purity there, a quiet rebellion against the life she had been forced into. He felt it reach for him, as if her spirit recognized his even before either of them said a word. "You're not from here," she said finally, her voice soft, almost questioning. He tilted his head, his lips curving into something that was almost a smile. "No one ever is," he answered, his tone low, rough like gravel. For a moment, silence stretched between them, filled only by the creak of the saloon's floorboards and the lonely whistle of wind outside. Something unspoken passed through that silence, something dangerous and undeniable. She looked down, biting her lip, then quickly excused herself and disappeared into the back room. The rough Apache sat still, his whiskey untouched. He had faced rifles and knives without flinching, but that single exchange had unsettled him more than any battle. She was forbidden, he knew it, felt it in every bone. She was too young, too untouched by the world he carried on his back. And yet, for the first time in a long time, he wanted something more than survival. The hunger stirred again, sharper now, pulling at him in ways he didn't want to admit. The Apache had no use for dreams. But that night, As he lay on his bedroll beneath the desert stars, he found himself thinking of her eyes, her voice, the fragile strength in her movements. He told himself he would ride at dawn, leave the settlement behind, and bury this desire like he had buried all the others. But even as he closed his eyes, he knew he was lying to himself. The dawn came with its usual desert cruelty, the sun spilling fire over the jagged cliffs and painting the sand in gold. The rough Apache woke with the sharp clarity of a man who never slept deeply. Years of being hunted had trained his body to rise at the faintest sound, but this morning, the only sound was the restless shifting of his Mustang tethered nearby. He stretched, rolled his shoulders, and breathed the dry air deep into his lungs. He should have left then. Every instinct told him to ride on, to vanish into the horizon before the town stirred awake. That was the rhythm that had kept him alive, never linger, never let roots take hold. But as he ran his hand down the Mustang's neck, he found himself looking back toward the cluster of wooden shacks, and the crooked saloon dot he thought of her, Anna. The barkeep had said her name so casually, yet it carried a weight he couldn't shake. Names meant little to him most days. Faces and voices blurred into the endless stretch of road and sky. But hers stayed with him, sharp as a blade and soft as a whisper all at once. Against his better judgment, he turned his horse back toward town. By the time he entered, the settlement was stirring to life. Women carried buckets of water, men loaded wagons, and children chased each other through the dust. Their laughter faltered when they saw him, but he ignored the wary stares. He dismounted outside the saloon and pushed through the doors again. Place smelled of stale whiskey and last night's smoke. Only a few men lingered inside, hunched over mugs of coffee. And there she was, Anna, sweeping the floor, her sleeves rolled up, strands of hair falling loose around her face. She looked different in the morning light, softer somehow, yet her presence still pulled at him with a force he couldn't resist. She paused when she saw him. Her grip tightened on the broom handle, not out of fear, but out of something else, something unspoken. "You're still here," she said, her voice quiet but steady. He leaned against the counter, his gaze fixed on her. "I ride where I please." Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "And you please to stay?" The Apache didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was its own confession. For a long moment, neither moved. The saloon seemed to fade around them, the murmurs of the few men drifting into nothing. There was only the pull between them, the spark that had ignited last night and now burned hotter in the daylight. He studied her, the way she held herself, the way her eyes flickered with both caution and curiosity. She was no hardened saloon girl. No, there was something untouched about her, something that made him feel as though he were standing at the edge of forbidden ground. "Why do you look at me like that?" she asked finally. Breaking the silence, he let out a breath, rough and low. "Because I can't not." Her cheeks flushed and she looked away, sweeping again as though to shield herself from the weight of his gaze. But he saw the tremor in her hands, the way her breath caught when he spoke. She felt it too, the pull, the danger, the promise of something they both knew could never last. The barkeep returned from the back, his eyes darting between the two of them. He frowned, setting a crate on the counter with a loud thud. "Anna," he said firmly, "go fetch more water." She hesitated, her eyes flickering to the Apache's one last time before she slipped past the doors and into the morning light. The rough Apache stayed where he was, his jaw tight, his hands curled loosely into fists at his sides. The spark had grown into a flame, and he knew it wouldn't be so easily smothered. He told himself to ride on, to put miles between himself and this girl who stirred something reckless in him. But deep down, he knew he wouldn't. That night, when the desert sky stretched wide and the stars blazed like cold fire, he found himself back in the saloon. The place buzzed with life again, laughter and music filling the air. And there she was once more, weaving between tables, her smile polite but her eyes searching for him. When their gazes met across the crowded room, the spark leapt again, hotter, brighter. Undeniable. It was no longer a question of if. The only question was when. The days that followed moved strangely, as if time itself had bent under the weight of their glances. The rough Apache had never been a man to linger in one place. Yet each sunrise found him still in the small settlement, his Mustang tied near the saloon, his presence shadowing the daily rhythms of the townsfolk. They whispered about him in hushed voices, about why he hadn't moved on, about what he was waiting for. But he knew. He was waiting for her. Their encounters were small things, fragments of a larger truth that neither dared to speak aloud. A brush of her sleeve as she passed him a drink. The flicker of her eyes toward him when she thought no one was watching. The faint tremor in her breath when he drew near. Each moment was nothing on its own, but together they wove a thread between them, pulling tighter each day until it felt as though the very air carried the strain. The Apache tried to fight it. He spent long hours outside town, riding into the hills, losing himself in the wind and dust. But even in the solitude of the desert, her image haunted him, the curve of her smile, the quiet strength in her gaze, the way she had said his presence unsettled her. He had lived through bullets and betrayals, and yet it was this fragile, forbidden closeness that shook him most. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the world in fire, he found her alone behind the saloon, drawing water from the well. The settlement was noisy with music and laughter, but here, in the shadow of the cliffs, it was quiet. Too quiet. She startled slightly when she saw him, her hand tightening on the rope. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. "And yet I am," he said simply, stepping closer. The bucket clattered against the side of the well as she pulled it up, her fingers trembling with the effort. He reached out without thinking, his hand brushing against hers as he steadied the rope. The touch was brief, accidental, but it lit through both of them like a strike of lightning. She froze, her breath catching, her eyes lifting to his. The desert wind stirred her hair, and in that moment, she looked both fragile and unyielding, like a wildflower blooming where it had no right to. "You scare me," she said softly. Though she didn't step away, he studied her face, every detail carved into his memory, the curve of her lips, the flush of her cheeks, the vulnerability she tried to hide. "Good," he murmured. "Fear keeps you alive." But even as he spoke the words, his hand lingered too long against hers, his body leaning closer than caution allowed. He could feel the warmth of her, the trembling line between innocence and desire. He wanted to cross it, to claim what his instincts screamed belonged to him. And yet some quiet voice inside warned him that crossing it would change everything. A door slammed nearby, breaking the spell. She jerked her hand back, the bucket spilling a splash of water onto the ground. Voices drifted from the saloon, laughter spilling into the night. "I should go," she whispered, gathering herself. He stepped back, letting the distance return, though it felt like a wound to do so. "Go then," he said, his voice rough, masking the storm that raged within him. She turned, walking quickly toward the light of the saloon. But before she vanished through the door, she glanced back at him. That glance was brief, but it was enough. It carried longing, fear, and the undeniable spark that had grown between them. The rough Apache stood there long after she disappeared, his fists clenched, his jaw tight. He had been many things in his life, hunter, fugitive, survivor, but never had he felt so utterly caught. She was forbidden, untouchable, and yet she had become the one thing he couldn't turn away from. That night, he lay awake under the desert stars, the memory of her touch burning hotter than any fire. He knew this tension couldn't hold forever. Threads pulled too tight always snapped, and when this one did, it would break them both. But even knowing the danger, he couldn't bring himself to ride away. Not anymore. The desert had a way of swallowing days whole, stretching time until it felt endless. But inside the Apache, the pressure was building like thunder before a storm. Every glance, every stolen moment with Anna had wound the thread tighter, and he knew it could not hold forever. The night it finally broke was one of those rare evenings when the air felt alive, heavy with the promise of rain though no clouds marked the sky. The saloon was loud, filled with laughter and drunken voices. But for him the world narrowed to one thing. Her. Anna moved between the tables as she always did, carrying drinks, offering soft words. But tonight there was something restless in her. She avoided his gaze at first, though he felt her presence with every step she took. Her hands trembled as she set glasses down, her smile quick and fleeting, as though she were trying to outrun something she could not name. When their eyes finally met across the crowded room, it was different. There was no hesitation, no pretense. Just a raw acknowledgement of the hunger that had been growing between them for days. She looked away first, but only after holding his gaze long enough to leave no doubt. The Apache rose without a word, his boots striking the floorboards with slow, steady weight. No one dared stop him. He followed her through the side door into the cooler night air, where the desert winds whispered against the wooden walls. She was already there, leaning against the railing, her breath uneven. She didn't look at him right away, but when she did, her eyes burned brighter than the lantern light above them. "You shouldn't have followed me," she said, though her voice trembled with something other than fear. He stepped closer, closing the space between them. "And yet here I am." For a moment neither spoke. The air between them pulsed with everything unsaid, the weeks of restraint, the weight of longing, the danger of what they both wanted. His hand hovered inches from hers, aching to close the distance, to claim what he had denied himself. "You'll ruin me," she whispered. Her eyes locked on his. "Or save you," he murmured back. His voice was low, rough, as though it came from the deepest part of him. And then the restraint broke. He reached for her, his hand sliding to the small of her back, pulling her against him. She gasped, her body stiff for only a heartbeat before it melted into his. The world around them fell away, the laughter from the saloon, the desert winds. The weight of consequences, all of it disappeared in the heat of that moment. Her hands pressed against his chest, not to push him away, but to steady herself. Her lips parted, her breath quick and shallow, and when he lowered his head, she didn't resist. Their mouths met in a kiss that was not gentle, but desperate. A collision of need and fire. It was the kiss of a man who had lived too long in shadows, who had carried too many scars, and of a woman who had hidden her fire behind duty and silence. Together they burned. When they finally pulled apart, she was trembling, her forehead resting against his chest. Her voice came in a broken whisper. "What are we doing?" He held her tighter, his jaw clenched as though the words cost him something. "Something we can't stop." She tilted her head back, her eyes glistening in the lantern light. In them, he saw fear, but also surrender. She wanted this as much as he did, perhaps more. And though every warning screamed at him, though he knew the danger it carried, he could not turn away. Their closeness deepened, each touch bolder than the last, the night around them thick with unspoken promises. She sighed against him, her voice barely a breath. I've never done this before." The words froze him, cutting through the haze of desire. He pulled back just enough to see her face, searching her eyes. And there, between her trembling breaths and the fire of her gaze, he found the truth. She was untouched. A storm raged inside him, shock, hunger, and something dangerously tender. He had known battle, betrayal, and blood. But this was different. This was fragile, sacred. And in that moment, the rough Apache understood. Nothing between them would ever be the same. The night pressed close around them, the desert air heavy with silence. broken only by the faint rattle of a shutter and the lonely cry of a coyote somewhere in the distance. Anna's words still echoed between them, fragile, trembling, impossible to ignore. "I've never—" The rough Apache stood very still, his arms still around her, his heartbeat pounding hard enough that she must have felt it. He had faced ambushes, stared down rifles, walked through storms of bullets, and none of it had shaken him the way this did. A virgin. He hadn't expected it. Not here, not in this place, not from a woman who carried herself with quiet strength, who worked among rough men every day without flinching. It was a truth she could have kept hidden, a truth no one would have guessed, but she had given it to him. And now it weighed heavy on his chest, heavier than any weapon he had ever carried. Anna looked up at him, her eyes wide, shining in the glow of the lantern above. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I've been careful. I've been waiting. And then you came." Her voice broke, a breath catching between her lips. "I can't explain it, but I don't want to keep waiting anymore." Her confession came with a tremor of fear, but beneath it burned something undeniable: desire. The same hunger that had haunted him in every glance, every stolen touch, was now spoken aloud. His jaw tightened as he cupped her face in his rough hand, his thumb brushing against her cheek. "You don't know what you're asking," he said, his voice low, ragged. "Yes," she breathed, leaning into his touch. "I do." The Apache's control wavered. The fire inside him, stoked for days, now threatened to consume them both. He pulled her closer, his lips finding hers again, slower this time, more deliberate. Her breath came quick, trembling against his mouth, her body arching into his as though pulled by some force stronger than either of them. Every sigh she released was a surrender, every touch a promise. His hands traced the curve of her back, her shoulders, memorizing the feel of her as though she might vanish at any moment. She clung to him, her fingers tangled in his shirt, her heart pounding fast against his chest. The world blurred. There was no saloon, no settlement, number past or future, only this moment, this closeness, this dangerous intimacy that made the rest of life feel small. "Anna," he murmured against her lips, the name rough in his throat. She looked up at him, her breath shallow, her lips parted. "Don't stop," she whispered, the words almost a plea, and he didn't. He kissed her again, deeper this time, until she sighed into him, her body yielding with each breath. The sound of the soft, trembling notes of desire breaking through her fear, nearly undid him. Between sighs, she confessed the truth of her heart. "I've never felt this way before. Never wanted anyone like this," her words were gasps, carried on the heat of the night. He held her tighter, torn between restraint and need. "You don't know what I am," he warned, his voice breaking under the weight of it, but she only shook her head, her eyes fierce even through her trembling. "I know enough. I know what you are to me." That undid him more than anything else. Not her innocence, not her confession, but the way she looked at him, as though he was more than a fugitive, more than a shadow of violence and scars. To her, in this moment, he was a man. Not the rough Apache, not the outlaw. Just a man. The passion grew fierce and undeniable. Their breaths tangled, their bodies pressed close, and in the heat of it all, she revealed what she had kept guarded for so long. "I am a virgin," she whispered again, the words spilling out between sighs, this time not with fear but with surrender. The rough Apache froze, his forehead resting against hers, his chest heaving with the effort to control himself. Her confession struck deeper than any bullet because it wasn't just about innocence, it was about trust. She was giving him something no one else had touched, something pure in a world that had taken so much from both of them. He closed his eyes, fighting the storm inside him. He wanted her God, he wanted her, but he also knew what it meant. If he crossed this line, he could never go back. Neither of them could. And yet, as she clung to him, her breath warm against his neck. He knew the choice was no longer his alone. Between sighs and whispers, the world had changed. Her words hung between them like smoke that would not clear. I am a virgin. The rough Apache had heard many things whispered to him in the dark, pleas, lies, curses, but never this. It wasn't only the truth of it that struck him. It was the way she said it, not ashamed, not afraid, but with trembling honesty, like an offering placed in his hands. He pulled back slightly, his dark eyes fixed on her, searching for any sign that she hadn't meant it. But all he saw was her trembling breath, the fierce light in her gaze, and the soft surrender of her lips still parted from their kiss. Anna. His voice cracked on her name, rougher than any desert wind. She pressed her forehead to his chest, her words spilling out between uneven breaths. I never told anyone. I never wanted to. But with you? I couldn't keep it hidden. She drew in a sharp inhale, her hands clutching at his shirt as if afraid he might step away. You make me feel alive in ways I never thought possible. I don't want to be afraid anymore. The Apache's heart pounded against his ribs, the weight of her trust pressing harder than any chain. He had lived his life as a shadow, a fugitive, a man who took what the world never meant to give. He knew violence, hunger, survival, but not this. Not the fragile, dangerous beauty of being chosen, of being trusted. You don't know me, he said finally, his voice low, as though speaking too loud might shatter her. Not really. You know the stories. You've heard what I've done. I don't care, she whispered fiercely, lifting her head, her eyes burning into his. I see you. Not the outlaw. Not the Apache they whisper about. You. Her words cut through the armor he had worn for years, striking at something he thought had died long ago. To be seen not feared, not judged, but seen was a revelation more terrifying than any ambush he had faced. He stepped back a fraction, dragging a hand down his face as though to steady himself. The desert night closed in around them, the air sharp with silence. You don't understand what you're asking of me, he muttered, half to himself. Anna reached for him, her fingers brushing his hand. I'm not asking for promises. I'm not asking for forever. I'm asking for this. For you. For tonight. Her voice, fragile yet uncheckable, undid him. He felt his defenses crumble, the walls he had built brick by brick through years of pain breaking apart under the weight of her honesty. For a long moment, he said nothing, his breath ragged, his jaw clenched. Inside him, two men warred, the hardened survivor who knew better than to let anyone close, and the man who longed for her touch, her trust, her surrender. Finally, he spoke, his voice raw, almost a growl. You give me this truth, and it binds me. You understand? Anna nodded, her eyes never leaving his. I understand. The Apache's chest rose and fell with the force of his breathing. He wanted to resist, to walk away, to keep the distance that had always kept him safe. But as her hand slipped fully into his, small and soft against his scarred palm, he knew he was already lost. He pulled her close again, his forehead resting against hers. His voice dropped to a whisper. Then you must know, Anna. Once I take this from you, I can never be the same. Her breath trembled against his lips. Neither can I. The simplicity of her answer broke the last of his restraint. He kissed her again, fiercely, almost desperately, his hands framing her face as though she were both fragile and unyielding. Every sigh that escaped her lips carved itself into him, every whispered breath sealing what had already been decided. This was no longer about hunger or survival. This was revelation. The rough Apache, who had lived his life by instinct and fire, now felt something he had never allowed himself before, something raw, unrelenting, and terrifying in its power. Tenderness. In her confession, she had given him not only her innocence but a glimpse of what he had thought impossible, a future that was more than blood and sand. And though he knew the desert would not forgive them, though he knew the world would try to tear this from them, he also knew this truth: he could no longer imagine himself without her. Her revelation had bound him, and in the stillness of the desert night he accepted the weight of it. The desert night held its breath, as though even the stars waited to hear his decision. Anna's revelation still echoed inside him, louder than the rush of blood in his ears. "I am a virgin." Her voice, her trust, her surrender, it had pierced through every wall he had built, every scar he carried. The rough Apache had lived his life by one rule: take nothing that could not be left behind. It was how he had survived. Women, towns, fleeting pleasures, he had ridden away from them all without looking back. But Anna was not something he could abandon. She had given him her truth, and with it, she had claimed a piece of him he hadn't known still existed. Her hand rested lightly in his, her breath warm against his chest, her eyes searching his face with both fear and hope. She had no weapon, no armor, nothing but her trust. And somehow, that was more dangerous than any rifle pointed at him. He could feel two paths stretching before him. One was familiar: the road, the desert, the endless fight for survival. To ride away now would be simple. Leave her behind before the bond tightened further, before her innocence chained him to something he could not protect. It was the path of the rough Apache, the outlaw, the shadow. The other path was new, terrifying in its unfamiliarity. To stay, to claim her trust not just with desire but with something deeper. To let himself be bound by her revelation, her touch, her whispered plea. It was the path of a man, not an outlaw. But it was also the path that could destroy them both, for the world had no mercy for a girl who gave herself to a man like him. His chest rose and fell, heavy with the weight of it. He looked down at her, her face soft in the lantern glow, her eyes steady even through her trembling. She was ready to give herself to him, not because she didn't understand the danger, but because she did and still chose him. That choice broke something in him. With a rough exhale, he lifted her chin with his scarred hand, forcing her eyes to meet his. "Anna," he said, his voice low, raw, "you don't know what this makes of me." Her lips curved into the faintest trembling smile. "Yes, I do. It makes you mine." The words struck deeper than any blade. For a long moment, he said nothing, his silence thick as the desert air. Then, slowly, he pulled her into his arms, holding her as though he could shield her from the world itself. His lips brushed her hair, and his voice rumbled against her ear. Then so be it. The decision was made. He was no longer just the rough Apache, no longer just the shadow that rode through towns and vanished into dust. He was hers. And with that choice came a power greater than survival purpose. When their lips met again, it was not the desperate hunger of before, but something steadier, fiercer. Each sigh she gave him was a vow, each touch an anchor binding him to her. Between the gasps and whispers, he felt the shift inside himself, the turning point he could not come back from. For years he had been a man of storms, of fleeting nights and vanishing trails. But Anna's revelation had lit a fire he could not extinguish, a fire that made the desert seem less empty, the nights less cold. As he held her, he knew the world would come for him soon: soldiers, bounty hunters, all the enemies his name had earned. But now, for the first time, he did not face that storm alone. The girl who had whispered her truth between sighs had given him something no bullet could take. And as the night stretched on, with her breath warm against his skin and her trust binding him tighter than chains, the rough Apache understood the final truth. He had not conquered her. She had conquered him, and he would never be the same.